Now, the next presenter that you will hear is a man of God that I had the opportunity of hearing about 7 years ago. And as great as his words were, and as impactful as those words were, really it was some of the books that he had written that actually impacted me. And I believe the title of that book that I first read was Unfounded Loyalty, which helped me to have a better perspective of historically how those within the African American community were not actually connecting their votes to their values. Well, Wayne Perryman is a former newspaper publisher and radio talk show host. He has also been known for his work with at-risk youth, gang members, and professional athletes. He's a co-founder of Youth Challenge and the founder of Role Models Unlimited. Many of his works have been seen and read on media outlets that would include Sports Illustrated, also that would include ABC's Home Show, Fox's Hannity and Combs, The Michael Medved Show, C-SPAN, Book TV, The 700 Club, TBN. He's also been listed in Speak Up magazine and a multitude of other publication and radio appearances around the country. I want to say that this is a person, like many of those who will be speaking for us, is not just committed to God and committed to country, but also committed to serving in his community. He has a number of resources that are available. I mentioned to you the one book that I did read, but also particularly if you're reaching out to young people, teens and young people who impacted the world. And then secondly, this book, Whites, Blacks, and Racist Democrats, is also a book that William Perryman has also written. I want to ask you to give a strong round of applause and warm welcome for the Reverend Wayne Perryman.
Wouldn't this world be better if the folks would meet and say, I know something good about you, and treat you just that way? Wouldn't it be fine and dandy if each handshake fond and true carried with assurance, I know something good about you? Wouldn't life be a lot more happier if the good that's in us all was the only thing about us folks bothered to recall? Wouldn't life be a lot more happier if we praise the good we see, for there's such a lot of goodness in the worst of you and me? Wouldn't it be a fine way of practicing and a nice way of thinking too, that you know something good about me and I know something good about you? When it comes to Black history, there are a lot of good things I could say about it. Of all the books that I've written, most have been on history, from the Bible times to our more recent times. A few years ago, I was asked to speak at a school for Black History Month. And before I went on the stage, the principal warned me not to say anything about God because of the separation of church and state. I turned to her and said, ma'am, when it comes to Black history, it is easier to remove the blackness from my skin than it is to remove God from my historical past. A fact that many young people in this generation are not aware of. In Deuteronomy, the 6th chapter, in the 7th verse, the Lord speaks to Moses and tells Moses, you are about to integrate into a new community. Their culture is going to be far different than your own. You had just come out of slavery, and now you're coming into a brand new culture. Moses, when you get there, I don't want you to act like those people. You are a different type of people. This is what I want you to do, Moses. He said, I want you to spend every waking moment teaching your children about their history. I want you to teach them when they're sitting down, teach them when they're standing up, teach them when they're lying down, teach them when they're going for a walk, teach them their history when they wake up in the morning. And so you won't forget to do so. I want you to put a sign on your forehead. I want you to tie a string around your finger. Moses, I want you to put a notice over the doorpost to remind you to teach your children your history. He said, I want you to teach them their history because I want them to understand that our lifestyle works best for us, that we can't be like anyone else. You are very unique, and only you could tell the story of your own history. In other words, I don't want you to take on the ways and the cultures of the other people. You may integrate, but I don't want you to assimilate. The Lord knew that if the Jews lost their history, they would also lose their identity. And if they lost their identity, they would also lose their destiny, because both their identity and destiny was tied to God's divinity. As we say today, if you don't know where you're coming from, you certainly don't know where you're going. Harvard professor Arthur Schlesinger Jr. said this in his book, Disuniting America. He said the first step in liquidating a people is to erase their memory, destroy their culture and their history, and then have someone to invent a new book and manufacture a new culture and a new history. And before long, they will begin to forget who they are and who they were. Today, because historians are constantly revising history, we have a nation and a generation that have lost their true identity. Let me give you an example of that in a little story about a little eagle. It goes like this. While playing in the woods adjacent to the farmhouse, which was located down in the valley, a young boy stumbled on what appeared to be an abandoned eagle's nest with a freshly laid egg in it. Not sure whether the mother was dead or alive, the young boy took the egg back to the farmhouse and placed the egg among the hen's nest with her other eggs. By and by, all the eggs hatched, and the little chicks looked the same except for the one that contained the baby eagle. Like all loving mothers, the mother hen saw no difference in her children and loved all of the newly hatched babies the same. No one paid much attention to the little eagle. His chickens and brothers taught him how to walk like a chicken, how to talk like a chicken, and how to eat the chicken food and play the chicken games. Even though they tried to treat him as one of them, he never really felt like he was part of them. Deep down inside, he always knew that he was different. Yes, he had a beak like a chicken, he had feet like a chicken, and he had feathers like a chicken, but he didn't think like a chicken. He didn't move like a chicken. Neither did he have a chicken mind or chicken ideas. He knew he was different. His chicken brothers and sisters knew he was different, but no one knew who he was or what he was. Many times while playing in the farmyard just outside of the barn, the little eagle would gaze upward looking at the birds soaring high above the trees. Sometime he would close his eyes and flap his wings like the birds in the air, and oftentimes he would pretend that he was flying just like them. One day, he decided to confide in his chicken brother and told him his desire to go leave the valley and go yonder on the mountaintop and stretch his wings and fly like the other birds. His chicken brother laughed hysterically and told the other chickens of his brother's ridiculous desire to fly like the other birds. They laughed and teased the little eagle. The eagle was so hurt and embarrassed that he decided from now on he would keep his thoughts to himself. Not only did the eagle keep his thoughts to himself, the little eagle often stayed to himself. He finally realized, after trying over and over again, there was no way he can adapt to the chicken culture. 3 months later, the eagle had outgrown the chickens, but still no one acknowledged that he was different. One day, while playing in the yard, he stood by the side of the barn and gazed upward into the sky. There he saw mighty eagles soaring high above the mountaintops. With his eyes fixed on them, he started walking up the side of the mountain. One of his chicken brothers noticed him and ran and asked him, why was he going up on the mountain? But the little eagle said nothing and just kept right on walking. The other chickens gathered at the bottom of the mountain and began to tease him and call him names, but the little eagle said nothing and just kept right on walking. The mother hen ran from the barn and pleaded with him to come down off of the mountain. But the little eagle said nothing and just kept right on walking. When he got to the mountaintop, he stood at the edge and looked in all directions as if he was charting his flight pattern. The mother hen cried again and begged him to come back down into the valley. With compassion in his heart and sympathy in the voice, the little eagle looked at his mother and said, Mother, all my life I tried to live like a chicken. I tried to walk like a chicken, and God knows I tried to talk like a chicken. I ate your chicken food and I played your chicken game. As long as I can remember, I've always felt like a victim in the valley. Now that I know what it's like to be on the mountaintop, I can no longer contemplate living in the valley. My dear mother, down in the valley, I experienced frustration. Down in the valley, I longed for my emancipation. My brothers and sisters talked about me in the valley, and oftentimes they tried to hold me back. Down in the valley, I was ridiculed, rejected, and disrespected, and never allowed to be myself. You see, my dear mother, the valley only offered me victimizations, but never any victories. I'm tired now. I no longer want to be a victim in the valley. I want to be a monument on the mountaintop. I must go now. It's time for me to leave. With tears in her eyes, the mother hen said to her son, But where will you go? The young eagle flapped his powerful wings, took a leap off the side of the mountain, and as he took flight, he smiled at his mother and said, Mother, I'm going where no man has gone before. Like the little eagle, African Americans have lost their identity in this culture. When you lose your identity, you start doing things just to fit into the culture around you so that you could be accepted. You start acting like others. You're no longer yourself. One person put it this way: some people spend money that they don't have to buy things that they don't need to impress people that they don't like. History tells us that, like the Jews, we were a race and a culture that when we walked with God, the black community prospered. Our problems came when we started acting like we no longer needed God because we traded God's promises for government programs. When we walked with God, we had a higher percentage of two-parent households and a lower percentage of single-parent households. When we walked with God, we had a higher percentage of children born from wedlock and a lower percentage of children born out of wedlock. When we walked with God, we had a higher percentage of black folks who put their dependence on Christ and a lower percentage of those who put their dependence on crack. When we walked with God, we had a higher percentage of parents who spanked their children and a lower percentage of parents who neglected their children. We had a higher percentage of blacks who supported black businesses and a lower percentage of blacks who ignored black businesses. We had a higher percentage of kids who were members of church and a lower percentage of kids who were members of gangs. When we walked with God, we had a higher percentage of kids that brought books to school and a lower percentage of kids who brought guns to school. We had a higher percentage of kids who played with each other and a lower percentage of kids who killed one another. When we walk with God, we praised and cherished our mothers and wrote romantic songs about their daughters. After we lost our identity, we started referring to those same young girls as bitches and hoes, and young black men as dogs. When we walked with God, we had unity in our community. In the late 1800s, Booker T. Washington started the Negro Business League. And every year, thousands of blacks would gather at his conference to learn new ways how to improve the conditions of our people. And they didn't separate conventions like we have today. Booker T. wasn't concerned with politics or the political parties. He was only concerned about his people. In 1896, he opened up his convention with the following words. He said, "The aim will be, as it has in the previous 4 years, is to bring together for a quiet conference, not politicians, but representatives of the common, hardworking farmers and mechanics, and the backbone and the sinew of the Negro race, the black ministers and our teachers." He said, "I want to emphasize the object of these conferences. When they were first instituted, it was to confine ourselves mainly to the conditions within our own power to remedy. So we might discuss many wrong things which should be righted, but it seems to me that it's best to lay hold of the things that we can put right rather than those things that we can find fault with." In 1883, during the National Convention of Colored Men, Frederick Douglass made a similar statement. He said, "If 6 million colored people of this country, armed with the Constitution of the United States, with 1 million votes of their own, and millions of white men at their back, whose hearts are responsive to our claims, if we cannot organize and combine to defend ourselves against discrimination and oppression, it would be idle to expect them in the Republican Party or any political party to organize and combine on our behalf." He said, "Men may combine or unify to prevent cruelty to animals, for they are dumb and they can't speak for themselves. But we are men and must speak for ourselves, or we should not be spoken for at all. Parties were made for men, not men for parties." When the Jews walked with God, they taught their children their history. They had a clear view of who they were, their identity. When they walked with God, they prospered. In the 2nd chapter of Judges, the 10th through the 12th verse, it said, when the older generation, when the older blacks died off, there was no one to teach the younger generation their history. And because they lost the true identity of their history, they did things like the other people who felt like they no longer needed God. Many of you know that in the black community, the black mother, the black woman was highly revered. They would say, "Yes, ma'am," and "Yes, sir." An older black woman could walk down the street at midnight in the black community and no one would bother her because they had the high respect and the high regard. They did this because Big Mama, which they call our grandmother, Big Mama would sit by the stove at night and talk to the kids about their history and their struggles. They didn't have TV, and one of the biggest entertainments was either sitting on the porch listening to the old folks talk and train their kids about the importance of Christian character. Those days are pretty much gone now. The older generations are dying off. Like Moses, there's no one to really tell them their history. We have a generation of black children that know nothing about black history. Modern day political science professors know nothing about the connection of God in our history. And so when you go to college and you study poli-sci black history, God is completely left out of that history. Building character was one of the main things that was important in the black community. Our grandmothers and mothers would tell us that beauty was only skin deep, and they would teach us to have character. They would teach us to respect our women and respect the young girls. We had events in our community and no one brought guns. People would laugh and talk and have a good time. They didn't hate each other, they loved each other, and they were like a family. Not only have our children forgotten their history, I say as an African American preacher, our church has lost their history as well. Harvard economist Richard Freeman told Christianity Today that church attendance was the best predictor of which young inner city black males were likely to escape the syndrome of gangs and drugs. And he went on to talk about the historical role of the black church and how the black church was more than just a religious institution that taught them about Jesus. It was the one that inspired black businesses. It was, according to Buck O'Neill, I did an interview with him of the Negro Baseball League. Buck O'Neill said during the time of the Negro Baseball League, the churches would close early, and they would pack their lunches, and they would come out and watch the Negro Baseball League play. History shows that the Negro Baseball League drew more fans than the Yankees and the Dodgers and the white baseball leagues. They were so supportive of the Negro Baseball League that many of the churches would take them in because they couldn't stay at the hotels. If you watch the movie 42, that the Negro Baseball League would come into the towns, and it was the churches that will open up their homes so that they would have some place to stay. In a Newsweek article on June 1st, 1998, the reporter agreed in the article God versus Gangs and said, what is the hottest ideal of fighting crimes? And that Newsweek article referred to the old black church, how it used to be. W.E.B. Du Bois talked about the impact of the black church. Professor Nancy Boyd Franklin talked about the impact of the black church. But most of us have lost our identity. We're no longer the people that we used to be because we lost our history. When you lose your history, you lose your identity. When you lose your identity, you lose your destiny. The African American minister was so important back in the day to our community. Even Bill Cosby said that we had no one else to look up to in our community except the black clergy. The preacher and the black church were the central part of every black community. The African American culture did not evolve by accident. It was meticulously developed and designed through the wisdom and the leadership of the black clergy. Using the Bible as their guide, they selected from the Western culture those cultural components that they thought were best for the people and built a culture within a culture. The impact that they had on the African American cannot be denied or ignored, nor can we ignore the powerful influence that such men and women maintain today. The black clergy was not a magician or a man born with extraordinary power. He was merely an ordinary man, empowered by his faith in God. Without God, he was hopeless and helpless. The wisdom he expressed came from God, the courage that he possessed came from God, and the foundation on which he rested came came from God. It was God through his divine word, the Bible, that inspired the black clergy to build churches, open up schools and colleges, encourage members to start new businesses. Then God told them to boldly stand up for righteousness and challenge social injustice. The black clergy were the spiritual gardeners who planted seeds of righteousness in the fertile hearts of black men and women. And from those seeds grew a strong culture and a strong people rooted in righteousness and grounded in God. A people who looked to God for everything and based all of their commitments on if it's the Lord's will. Through the pruning and planting of God's gardeners, African Americans blossom into a beautiful culture, one with strong morals, strong family values, and a strong faith in God. Today, our culture garden as we once knew it is all but destroyed. Many of our spiritual gardeners have lost the art of planting and pruning, while others are trading in their plows and shears for politics and studying preaching no more. Today, our culture garden is filled with weeds that produce gang violence, alcoholism, drugs, teenage pregnancy, and broken homes. The flowers that once blossomed with pride in the African American paradise are now starting to wither, while others are being rooted up by non-religious government programs and by ministers who are compromising their godly standards for status in society. Isaiah referred to these individuals as greedy, dumb dogs who lost the boldness to bark, preachers who've lost the true black identity. Our culture doesn't look the same anymore. It seems as if everyone's taking advantage of our cultural experience and planting everything in our garden except those things that made us a strong people. The old-time black minister is rarely seen around the garden anymore. He's been replaced with representatives of the women's movement, the gay rights movement, and every other group that claim they can identify with us, all planning their own ideas and agenda. There's so many people in our garden, there's hardly room for us. And none are interested in planting our cultural seeds that are God-fearing people, strong families, and a race with high moral standards. The beautiful species that we once knew seem to no longer existed. We must do something. We must do it now. We must learn of our culture before we can appreciate our culture. We must appreciate our culture before we can preserve our culture. We must not allow others to destroy our cultural beauty, nor can we remain passive and allow others to give us an identity that separates from the God who's done so much for us. We must embrace our own beauty and cherish our own identity, and we must never allow others to devalue the things that made us so wonderfully unique. And we must never allow others to determine our destiny when they have never been a part of our dignity. If somehow our great-grandmothers could look from their grave and see the fragmentation in our community today, they will probably weep and say these words: there's a new generation that knows nothing of our past or the battles that we fought to win. If only they knew of those special times, perhaps we'll become a family again. God bless you.